I've always enjoyed working with visual imagery, so photography, and now working with artists.
Yeah.
And I find comics are a really interesting way of telling people stories that everyone can understand. You can see them and you can read them, and you get to know an individual through the comics that I make. The everyday hero is what I really like to meet, and that could be someone like Khalid down here, who is from Syria, and he was a 23-year-old student, and he was photographing the Syrian revolution, and he went through an experience, and he never thought he'd go through that. He's just a student, and then life took him on this journey, and now he lives in Norway, and it's just a real privilege for me to sit down and he tells me this stuff, and this is stuff that we see on the BBC News every night or in the newspaper or wherever, and my life and job gives me an ability to see behind the news and actually meet people like him face to face and listen to him, and that's why I do what I do. You know, when I was doing my A-levels, I wanted to be a fashion designer.
That is so cool.
And I got all of my mum's Vogue and Elle magazines, and all of my friends were getting like Saturday jobs in Sainsbury's or Tesco's and things like this. And I sat down one weekend and went through my mum's Vogue magazines and the directory in the back of the magazines for all the shops in London.
Yeah.
And so I phoned up Gucci and Yves Saint Laurent and Armani and all these people and asked them for a Saturday job, and Yves Saint Laurent called me down in Bond Street, called me down for a meeting, and I went down there and they gave me the Saturday job, which was to fold up shirts. You know, when you go into the shop and you try on a shirt and then you just dump it there, my job was to fold up the shirt and put them back on the shelf. And so I got a job with Yves Saint Laurent, and all of my friends used to take the mickey out of me because, you know, they were working in Tesco's on the tills, and I was like down in the Yves Saint Laurent like folding up shirts and stuff, but I thought it was great. And I really liked it. And then I was always very enthusiastic, and one day I got asked to help with making the Christmas window display. And so suddenly I was there with like these creative directors with the mannequins and dressing them and putting all the tinsel and snow and all of that up. And it was really creative, and I realised like that's something I wanted to get into, is something creative. And so I applied to London School of Fashion, and I got a place there for when I finished my A-levels to do fashion journalism, I think. Jumped on a plane, went to India thinking I was going to go there for 6 months, and I came back 3 years later.
Wow.
So I went to India.
Like George Harrison.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Far less musically talented, or some would maybe disagree.
Karaoke nights.
Yeah. So I got to India. I was just turned 19, and I within about 2 weeks of being in India, I found a guru and 7 monks, and ended up living in a cave for about a year.
Wow.
And ordained as a sadhu, a monk. And I can show you, here is a picture of what I look like. So you have hardly changed today.
Quite right too.
Yeah?
Not a thing.
It's exactly the same, pretty much.
Yeah.
So I lived there, and there's a little bandage on my toe down there, which is where a scorpion had stung me in the middle of the night. So I woke up with a blanket over me, just lying on the floor of this cave, and felt this thing on my chest. And the scorpion shot down, and as it ran off the end of my foot, it stung me on the toe. And the guru helped me kind of get the poison out.
Yeah.
And so I stayed there, and I ordained as this monk, which meant that I was pretty much naked, covered in ash, grew long dreadlocks, had to do all these bizarre thing, and collecting fruit and berries and wood from the forest every day, and living in a cave, like a small cave the size of this room, way up at 3,000 metres up in the Himalayas. And so I left there after a year and went for a year-long pilgrimage across India, bare feet, just wearing a piece of cloth, a sarong, around me, super skinny, and these dreads, and I went crisscrossing all over India from north to south, east to west, everywhere, just jumping on and off buses and trains and whatever, and was the freest, most wild time of my life. I was just free. I didn't have any a lot of people, some people have asked me, like, did you get lost? And the nice thing about that time in my life, and maybe a little bit at the moment as well, is that I didn't have a destination. And if you don't have a destination, you can't get lost. I was, after about the third year of being in India, I was sitting again in the Himalayas in a natural hot spring. So this really nice stone hot bath surrounded by snow on the side of a mountain, looking at this huge great mountain in front of me. And I met there a guy who's now become one of my best friends, Chris. He's the same age as me, so we were both 22 years old, and we were sitting there in this hot spring together looking at this massive Himalayan mountain. And Chris had finished university, was on a 6-month trip in India, and was about to go back to England and become a diplomat with the Foreign Office. And that was his. And I was sitting there in this hot spring thinking, suddenly, what's my future? What do I do? I've got, like, I didn't do that well at school. I've now got loads of stories of living in caves, wandering around India, but what am I going to do with my life? And I'm sitting next to this guy who's become a really good friend, and he's suddenly got diplomat, Foreign Office future ahead of him. So I thought, actually, I'm going to start putting together all this stuff that I've learned here over 3 years in India into something constructive. So I'm going to go to university. And I applied for the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, SOAS. And I went there so I left India, I went there when I was 23, and I studied political geography of South Asia. And there I suddenly learned all this stuff about human geography and climate change and river networks and politics and all of this stuff that I'd been seeing for 3 years in India, but suddenly put it all together, and it was like putting together a jigsaw, all these little bits that I'd seen, and I started putting it all together, and I loved it. And SOAS was great, and it was the perfect place for me to study. And I finished at SOAS, and I did well at university, and came out and went back to India and started working for a newspaper as a photojournalist. And on Boxing Day 2004, the South Asian tsunami happened, and one of my friends from university was working in North Sri Lanka, and he called me that day and said, there's been this massive tsunami, can you come and help me? So I got on a plane, I went to North Sri Lanka, I had my life and girlfriend and job and everything was in Bombay in India, and I said, I'm going to go, I said to my girlfriend, I'll be back in 10 days. I went to Sri Lanka and I stayed for 4 years. There's a theme here.
There's a 4-year cycle, yeah.
And so I got there, and North Sri Lanka is a place called the Vani. And the Vani was held and run by the Tamil Tiger, which was a guerrilla group that had been prescribed as a terrorist organisation, and they controlled that whole northern area. So it was a very sensitive, high security part of the world, and Sri Lanka is split into two. There was the government area and then the terrorist area in the north. And I found it fascinating. I got there, the tsunami had just hit. In that area, there was 16,000 people that died from the tsunami. And I got there 2 days after the tsunami, so it it was a disaster zone, and suddenly, for the first time in my life, I was confronted with a massive natural disaster, like a tsunami, and it was horrible. But something in me said, "Stay and work with this." A bit like when I got to the cave.
Yeah.
The cave was very difficult, but something in me said, "Stay." And so I stayed, and then I got offered a job with First, I got offered a job with the Norwegian People's Aid, and I worked with them, and I developed a really cool thing called the Tsunami Education Project, TEP, which we called it. And all these villagers that had been hit by the tsunami didn't know what had hit them. They didn't have geography education, and so these were fishermen and people who had worshipped the sea and worked around the sea, and they were fishermen who had celebrations, and everything was them and the sea. And suddenly the sea had turned on them and killed them.
Yeah.
This 17-meter wave, just bang. And so they didn't know what it was, and they thought God was angry with them, or it was because they lived in a terrorist-held area that the Americans had put a nuclear bomb under the water, under the ocean, and caused this tsunami. There was all these superstitions and rumours happening. So I created this tsunami education project, which used animation and kind of 3D graphics to present to villagers what had happened. That there had been this underground earthquake, it had caused a ripple in the water, and it had caused this tsunami. So we used to have like a water machine that you get in offices where you pour your water, and when it goes bloop, 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 the water goes up and it ripples on the top. That's basically a tsunami. Energy rises and it causes ripples. So we'd take all these kind of tools and objects around to villages and teach people what had happened. And I got to meet all of these wonderful people in these remote jungle villages of Sri Lanka, and I got to meet the Tamil Tigers, and then the United Nations offered me a job as the Tamil Tigers and the government started slipping back into a war zone, into a conflict. And so then the last 2 years of my time in Sri Lanka was very much in conflict, and there was like 500,000 civilians moving around, and my job was to work with those civilians, work with the Tamil Tigers, work with the other NGOs and the United Nations to try and see where people can go for safety, and we can give them shelter and food and water, whilst the Tamil Tigers and the army fight over there. We'll look after you over here. Comics are, when you see a photograph, so when you see a photograph like this, you can be interested in these women, but they're not you. And they don't look like you, they don't wear your clothes, they're something other. When you look at a comic like Khalid down here, because it's drawn, because it's not so personalised that it's not a photograph, that could be you. And in a comic, you can take people in to meet Khalid. And you can meet his mum and his dad and his children and his wife and all of those things, and suddenly he becomes three-dimensional. And he becomes a human being because you get to know him through the comic. And I find that when I've been a photographer before or a filmmaker, there's always, that's very interesting, but it's someone else. With a comic, that could be me. And the other thing is, when you deal with such sensitive topics like we do, like trafficking or migration or conflict, they're very, very sensitive topics that people are scared to show their face on a camera, understandably. Whereas you can draw their pictures, and that guy Khalid is a real person, but no one can go after him because he's just a comic book character. So it anonymizes the characters, at the same time allows them to tell you their story. And therefore I find that a really powerful way of telling people these stories without compromising their security.